11:33, so we want to make sure you have plenty of time and don't want to cut you short on that. So we should probably get started, and people will continue to come on as the webinar goes. That's normally what happens. So I want to welcome everybody back to the dairy webinar series hosted here by UVM, and of course supported by so many of our wonderful sponsors and grants that we've been involved in through USDA SARE and NIFA and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture as well, and really appreciate their support. And today, Dr. Glenda, now I should have asked you how to properly pronounce your last name, so I'll let you say that. Is it Pereira?
Yes, Pereira. Ah, good job.
And I've talked about Dr. Pereira quite a bit actually through the webinar series. I keep saying that you're going to join us, and because we've had different questions come up about breeds of cattle, etc. And Glenda is a new professor and extension dairy specialist at the University of Maine. So right next door, we feel really fortunate to have you join us today, but also to just have you in the area, and definitely look forward to working with you on whatever projects we scheme up, which I'm sure there'll be plenty of those in the coming years. And Glenda just finished up not that many months ago at the University of Minnesota, and Glenda was working with Brad Hines, who we've had on this webinar series before. He actually, Glenda, was scheduled to come to Vermont in March of 2020 and ended up not coming because it was the start of the pandemic. So hopefully we'll be able to get him actually here at some point. And today Glenda's going to be talking about cows, breeding rotations for organic and low input herds, feed efficiency, and polled and disbudding management, and whatever else she feels like talking about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you,
Heather. And yes, we will be working together in the future, and there's a lot of research to still be done. So I'm excited for that. And we do have ties where we've worked with some people before that are the same. So working with Brad Hines, I'm sure, you know, we always continue to work with our mentors and advisors. So I'm excited to do that. And so we can work across the country as well, and not only in the Northeast, because some of the challenges in the Northeast are similar to the challenges of other dairy producers in the Midwest or in the West. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to move you out of way here. Perfect. Okay. Hey, so as Heather mentioned, my name is Dr. Glenda Pereira, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Maine. So I have a split appointment. I'm 85% extension, and then 15% an assistant professor within the School of Food and Agriculture. And Heather already mentioned a bit of my background, but I grew up in the Azores, where my dad and his family are dairy farmers themselves. So in this picture here, you can see that this was when I was a year old. I'm with my grandma, and we have some Holstein cows in the back. Those Holstein cows look a little bit fleshy, and I was talking to Susan at the beginning and saying that the genetic selection we've done over the past 30 years, which is how old I am, so you can sort of see the trends from what the cows looked like 30 years ago to what the cows look like today. When I moved from the Azores to Rhode Island, I did go on to pursue my animal science degree at the University of Rhode Island, URI. And from there, I got to do an internship at the University of Minnesota before I moved to Visalia, where I worked as an intern for Worldwide Sires, and they handle all of the marketing for select sires outside of the Americas. So that really gave me a really good scope of what dairying is like in California. Following that, I went to obtain my master's as well as my PhD. I'm working under Dr. Brad Hines, and I focused on work related to precision dairy technologies for low input in pasture-based dairy herds, because at the time when precision dairy technologies were being adopted, They were being adopted in commercial or conventional systems. And we know that in an organic or a pasture-based system, there are a lot of different challenges that the cattle face, and especially for monitoring behaviors that can impact how well the system operates. So that was a lot of what my master's research tried to evaluate. And then additionally, some of what I'll be talking about today is my crossbreeding research. And so a lot of these efforts for crossbreeding have come from the University of Minnesota and from my advisor, Dr. Brett Himes. And then today I sit in the position of assistant professor, where I get to, at the University of Maine, design and conduct integrated extension and applied research to address the high priorities issues, not only in Maine, but I hope across the region into New England and the Northeast. So today we'll be talking about breeds for organic and low input systems, pasture-based systems. We'll be talking about fertility, fly pressure, and if time allows, I hope to cover some considerations for polled breeding, and as well as A2 milk, because I know some folks are interested in the A2 gene for dairy cattle, and that may be a market that some people want to lead into. So I want to start off by having this slide here, and if you're willing to participate, you can, and unmute yourself. So what are some things that you think we need for an ideal grazing cow? So what's something that's really important in a pasture-based system? So just unmute yourself if you can, and share or type in the chat. Does anyone want to share? Well, let's see. John had mentioned agility, intake efficiency. Okay, those are some good ones. Anybody else? Capacity, body capacity. Feet and legs. What's maybe the most important one at the top? What's something that a lot of dairy producers take advantage of, as you can see in this picture? So what's really important for grazing dairy cattle? If anyone types in the chat and guesses. I mentioned it, we'll be overviewing it today. So space to graze. Anybody else? Whoops. So my top priority is always fertility, right? So some producers do practice seasonal calving. And so there's a short time when you can get those cows to breed back. For example, at the University of Minnesota, we have 2 breeding seasons, and there's really no opportunity for those cows to be bred outside of those 2 months because we're going to be seasonally calving. And we do that because we want to take advantage of the herbage mass in the beginning of the spring, right here in North America. We really have to take advantage of that season because unlike in the Azores and unlike in Ireland and New Zealand, we have a disadvantage where we're not able to graze 365 24/7. So it's important that our cows have good fertility. It's important that we're focusing on those components, right? High fat and protein, as well as low somatic cell count, because we know that that's something that dairy cows in organic or pasture-based dairy herds that they have as a challenge is the increase in somatic cell count or mastitis events. And then of course, the importance of that cow to convert grass to milk. So unlike a cow that may be confined and consuming TMR and the grass is, and the feed, the groceries are coming to her, these cows have to harvest the feed themselves. So it's important that they're smaller and they're functional because they're going to have to go and do the eating activity on their own. I think that artificial insemination is a must in a pasture-based in any system really, because you're going to take the most advantage out of your genetics if you're using artificial insemination. And then breed is a producer preference. However, I have my own opinions on what the optimal dairy cow looks like in a grazing or pasture-based setting. View our genetic progress in the Holstein breed. So if you look at this picture here, this cow to the left is actually a cow that is stuck in time or frozen in time, as I like to say. This cow is from 1964. So this is what the cows in 1964 used to look like. But over time, as I mentioned, we've we've made a lot of genetic progress, and specifically within the Holstein breed, and we've selected for milk production. And another thing that we selected for was stature. So we have seen these cows increase in their body size. And the thought behind that was that if we have taller cows, there's maybe more capacity for their rumen fill, so the cows can eat more. But we've actually noticed that that was not necessarily the case. So the ability for a cow to eat more does not mean that she's gonna directly, and it's not correlated with that the cow's gonna produce more. We've actually created an opportunity for some of her organs not to fit as accurately, and it has actually led to a high increase in the number of displaced abomasums because the cows have a lot more room internally for those organs to move around and be displaced. So the cows in 1970, they were producing about 9,000 pounds per year, whereas the cows today are really efficient in that they're producing about 24,000 pounds per year. And so one of the ways that we've actually been able to make that genetic progress, as well as focus on some traits within the Holstein breed specifically, is by using something as the net merit. So everybody here might be familiar with the net merit index. It's something that we use because it includes average prices and costs for all of the traits that are included in this index. So because feed costs obviously account for 50% of the costs on a dairy farm, we in 2021 actually included the feed saved trait as well as the heifer livability and the efficiency trait. But over time, and so starting in 1994, we created this index, and that includes all of the traits that the industry felt was important to make genetic progress within our population of US Holstein cows. And so for those of you that are not familiar, the net merit index is, so it's based on a 0, and if a cow has a positive, or if a sire has positive $400, that means that the offspring from that sire is going to make $400 more per her lifetime when compared to another sire or another cow in the population. So I wanted to make sure that we understood the net merit index. But for specifically for pasture-based and grazing herds, we have the grazing merit index. And so we have some of the similar traits again as the net merit index, because those are going to be the important traits for the functionality of the cow. But I want you to recognize that for our fertility traits, we do have a heavier focus on fertility. Again, that's because, as we mentioned in the beginning, it's important that those cows are getting bred back so that they have another lactation. And so I wanted to pull up some studies that had looked at the breed composition on organic or pasture-based farms so that you have an idea of what the farms in the US and across the pond are. So there was a study done surveying Wisconsin organic dairy producers, and 18 of the herds that were surveyed had Holstein cows, but 12 of the herds had a mix of breeds. So there was Holstein, Jersey, Brown Swiss, Guernsey, and other mixed breeds. In Minnesota, a similar study was done where they surveyed organic producers, and there was, out of the 35 herds that were surveyed, there was 40% of the herds did have Holsteins. However, 60% of the herds had crossbreds or mixed breeds. And then in England, there was a recent survey done on organic and low input systems. And in these 17 herds, most of the herds were actually crossbred herds. So the F1, where you cross two breeds, so a Holstein to another breed, or an F2, which is when you bring in a third breed. And only 20% of the cows in those 17 herds in England that were organic and low input were purebred herds. And so I had mentioned crossbreeding in the beginning, and I did some of my PhD research on this. And so crossbreeding is a mating system that complements the improvement of all of the breeds that we use in that rotation. And I'm going to talk about some rotations later on in the presentation. But the point of crossbreeding is that we're using the best bulls of the breeds, right? Again, because that genetic progress is really important. We want to use the best bulls of that breed, and we don't have to worry about the inbreeding depression when we're utilizing the best bulls. For those of you that maybe have checked out a sire catalog for either the Holstein or the Jersey breed. It can be difficult to mate your sires to the current population of the US Holsteins because the inbreeding coefficient continues to increase. So we're not worried about inbreeding within a crossbreeding rotation, so we can use the best sires of each of the breeds. So the benefit from crossbreeding is what we call either hybrid vigor or heterosis, and this is really a bonus. So when we're crossing two breeds, we're actually getting an added bonus, whether it's for production or for another trait. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. So research from the University of Minnesota has shown that the 3 breeds are the optimal rotation. So yes, you can only use 2 breeds, and then you're gonna, for example, if you start with Holstein, breed with Jersey, go back to Holstein. But that really limits the advantage that heterosis is gonna give you. And plus, with 3 breeds, you're actually gonna bring in another breed that has those traits that can complement the others. You can use 4 breeds in your rotation. However, it's really difficult, and this was research done at the University of Minnesota, it's really difficult to find a 4th breed that complements each other. So there's a couple of crossbreeding rotations I'm going to mention and teach you, and we'll walk through this together. So for functional traits such as fertility, health, and survival, we actually we have an advantage for crossbreeding. So with inbreeding, the traits that are at a disadvantage with inbreeding are the health, so the functional traits. The one that isn't is production, of course. So we can actually make really good progress with production. But with inbreeding, we do see that the fertility, health, and survival traits are affected when you have a higher inbreeding coefficient. As I mentioned, I did my PhD research at the University of Minnesota, and we have an organic herd with about 120 cows where production is at 40 pounds of milk. We do graze from May to October, and typically we are on a 2-day rotational grazing setup. And then, of course, in the winter months, there's not an opportunity to be outdoors, so the cows are on TMR. And then we do have a conventional herd that is basically like an organic herd, except for it's just maintained in an outdoor lot, in a confined outdoor lot in the summer and in the winter, and those cows are fed TMR. And then this is a setup of our pasture. So we do have about 160 acres for milking cows and young heifers. And if you see in the picture here, this is where our dairy barn is. So we're actually able to keep the cows on all of these pastures that are relatively close to the dairy barn. And so I wanted to, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the breeds that we have at the University of Minnesota or have explored for that optimal, to maximize how the cows perform on a grazing or pasture-based system. Some would say, well, why don't we utilize the New Zealand Holstein, which is a fair bit different than the North American Holstein, for a pasture-based or a grazing herd? So while the New Zealand Holstein Friesian genetics tend to give you medium-sized cows, I mean, they have better fertility than the North American Holstein, as well as they can have a similar milk volume. We have seen that there's a trend in this graph here where on the y-axis, we have the percentage of North American Holstein Friesian that are of Holstein Friesian ancestry. And then on the x-axis, we have the birth year. So as we see, and this is obviously a graph that's outdated, but what we can see here with the triangles is that those are the Holstein Friesian cows. And then with the circles, that's the Holstein Friesian Jersey crosses. And so what we see here is that the Holstein Friesian cows, which are indicated in the triangles, they actually share a lot of similar ancestry with the North American Holstein. And so if we want to utilize this in our grazing system, we're actually going to be seeing the similar trend between the New Zealand Friesian and the North American Holstein. And I want to emphasize that we've traditionally selected for the North American Holstein to be fed on a TMR diet, right? A high input TMR diet. So we have explored utilizing the New Zealand Friesian. So this is a crossbred, but this is a New Zealand Friesian Norwegian Red Jersey Holstein that was in our herd. So potentially a potential and alternative solution to utilizing just a purebred animal on a grazing or pasture-based system is to use a crossbred animal. And I had mentioned some of the benefits of crossbreeding. And so at the University of Minnesota, we've been crossbreeding for relatively 20 years. And we began with Holsteins and then transitioned to Jersey, bred those Holsteins to Jersey. But over the years, again, as I mentioned, we really found the crossbreeding rotation that really allows us to utilize the traits of the three breeds that are really having us maximize that heterosis. So through a lot of research and a lot of data for the past 20 years, researchers at the University of Minnesota have come to the conclusion that if you have the Holstein, the Viking Red, as well as the Montbéliard breeds in a crossbreeding rotation, which is now internationally known as Procross, you are going to have an animal that has the best traits, that encompasses the best traits of all of those breeds. So for example, when we include the Holstein in our crossbreeding rotation, we're going to have that production. When we include the Viking Red, which is based heavily on Ayrshire, and it's from Sweden and the Nordic countries, Denmark and Finland. This breed tends to be a little smaller in stature than the Holstein breed, but they tend to have higher fat and protein. And the Viking Red breeds in the Nordic countries have always selected for health and functionality of the dairy cow. And then additionally, bringing in the Montbéliard breed, this breed is from France. And you can see that this breed tends to have a bit more condition than our other traditional dairy breeds, such as Holstein and Viking Red. And that's because that has been something that they have focused on, muscularity and condition, as well as fat plus protein in the Montbéliard breed. So both breeds have an advantage over the Holstein breed based on what they've been selecting for in the previous 30 to 40 years. And again, the hybrid vigor from the two breed is about 50%, whereas when you're adding that third breed, you're really going to optimize and you're going to have the most advantage from heterosis when you have the three breeds in that crossbreeding rotation. And then of course we said, well, the crossbreeding rotation may work really well for a grazing and low input system, but we have an opportunity to find a crossbreeding rotation that really works well in a grazing system, because the animal seems to have to be a bit different, right? Some of those things that we talked about was fertility and then smaller and functional animal. And so over time, and this crossbreeding rotation has only been at the University of Minnesota for about 10 years, and that's when Brad Hines took over in that role. So the crossbreeding research that we've done with the Grace crossbreeding rotation is still in the preliminary stage, because as you know, when you're crossbreeding, it takes a bit of time to get that three breed crossbred animal, right? So if we're thinking of it's about 2 years until that cow is going to have that offspring, when that offspring is that first two breeds, whether it's Jersey and Viking Red, and then another rotation. So it takes relatively about 6 years to get an animal that is going to be made up of those three breeds. And then you obviously have to have a lot of data to compare between all of the animals that you're comparing. So that first lactation and then second lactation, it's important to have all of that data to then be able to say that this would be an optimal rotation for a pasture-based system. So for this rotation, we have the Jersey. Obviously, that's something that we wanted to take advantage of, is that the fact that Jerseys tend to have a smaller frame, but they do have the higher fat plus protein in their milk. And we wanted to include the Viking Red again, because we saw an opportunity for this breed to be included in both rotations, because there were just so many positives about the breed. And then the Normandy breed was brought in because this breed didn't fit really well in a high input system, but this breed fits really well in a low input or organic system because it is adapted to that in France. So some of you maybe have heard of the Comté region, and then there's some really good cheese that comes out of that. And so some of that cheese is made from Normandies in France. And so the Normandy breed, for some reason, tends to be one of the dairy breeds that holds the most condition. Over all of my years of body condition scoring cows, this breed just seems to hold a lot of condition, the Normandy breed, even more so than the Montbéliard breed. So I'm quite impressed with this breed. And I hope that some producers here in the US continue to utilize this breed in their pasture-based system. And then in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show a few pictures of the cows on our herd. So we do have purebred Holsteins. But again, we have those pro-cross. So the Viking Red Holstein Montbéliard, this is a pro-cross cow. And this cow is actually in her 4th lactation when she was pictured here. The Montbéliard sired cow, she's a Montbéliard Holstein Viking Red. And this cow is in her 1st lactation. And then this is what a Grace Cross cow will look like. So she's a Jersey, Normandy, Viking Red. So obviously if you're Jersey sired, you can expect those Jersey features and the muzzle and the coloring. And this cow was in her 2nd lactation. And this cow is an organic dairy cow, as well as this cow here. So this Normandy Viking Red Jersey Grace Cross crossbred. She's also a cow in our organic herd. So many folks may say, well, there's a lot of variation in body size within crossbreds. The cows may not always be the prettiest. However, I want to let you know that we can have some show-worthy cows within our herds, even if they are crossbreds. But I also want to mention that there is a lot of variation, as we mentioned. So all of these cows in this picture are actually Normandy sired. So you can't expect them all to look the same. We're just not in control of what genes they inherit from all of those breeds and from the sire and from the dam. So in this slide, I have some preliminary results for production for our Grace Cross cows. As I had mentioned, it takes a long time to have those 1st lactation animals and then have those 2nd lactation animals. So this research is really preliminary. But for our organic dairy herd, we compared purebred Holsteins, Holstein sired crossbreds that are part of that pro-cross rotation, Jersey sired crossbreds that are Grace Cross, Viking Red sired crossbreds that are both pro-cross and Grace Cross, and then the Montbéliard sired crossbreds and the Normandy sired crossbreds. So we did an analysis where we looked at all of those breeds which are present within the organic dairy herd. And you can see that the number of cows are pretty low. So we have about 10 purebred cows compared to 25 Holstein sired cows, etc. So again, this is preliminary research. But what I really want to highlight is that the milk, so the production for those cows, wasn't really significantly different across the board. And so we can see here that yes, the purebred Holstein did have higher production. Again, that was expected. But the Holstein sired crossbreds, and this is in an organic system, I just want to reemphasize that. And so the Holstein sired crossbreds, as well as the Normandy sired crossbreds, they didn't really differ from the Holstein cows. So it's important to note that even though some people may say, yes, you lose production, we actually didn't see that large of a difference, and especially for fat and protein. Again, I want to reemphasize that in the US specifically, we are paid for components, right? That fat and protein. So when we look across the board, comparing all of those breeds, we actually didn't see that there was any significant difference. And this is again with a small sample size, but there was no significant difference except for those Jersey sired crossbreds. They tended to have a lower fat plus protein content. But so we can see that across the board, the cows really compared nicely when we were comparing them to the purebred Holsteins. Right, and then now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other genetic traits that I had mentioned. And so we did a really nice study back a few years back where we took some data that from the herds, and I think I just saw a question from Sarah. So Sarah, are you referencing in that last slide what rations these cows were being fed? Yes. So I don't have the exact specifics, but these cows, so half the year they were on a TMR, and then the other half they were on pasture and they were supplemented with 2 pounds of grain on pasture. So strictly on pasture during the summertime, supplemented with 2 pounds of grain. But in the winter, they were fed TMR. Yes, sorry, I don't have the specific details. And again, this is preliminary. And my point was in being the comparison of the fat, that we don't lose the fat plus protein. Thanks for the question, Sarah. As I was mentioning, so we did a really nice study looking at fertility as well as some production traits in U.S. organic Jersey cows. So when we did this study, we were looking at the predicted transmitting abilities And this I'll reference to in the next, for the rest of the slides as PTA. And so a PTA is the estimate of the animal's genetic value for a trait that's passed for the offspring. So we'll often look at PTAs in the sire catalog. And so that's the expectation of what the value for the expectation of the offspring. So in this data set, we were only looking at organic herds in the US. So this isn't all organic herds, but this is a small population of the organic herds. And we found that from this data set, a fair bit of the breeds within the herds, within those herds were crossbreds and Jersey and other. So while Holstein cows tended to make up most of those herds, there was a good percentage of herds that had crossbreds, Jersey, and other. So we decided to look at Jersey cows specifically for this data set because our colleagues had looked at the Holstein cows. So we said, let's look at the Jerseys because they are another purebred, and they were the second purebred that made up those herds. This is a table of the herd makeup within that data set. So a fair bit of those herds were actually from Vermont, New York, and then Maine. So there was a fair bit of those herds that were in the Northeast and New England. So again, as I mentioned, we were looking at the sire PTA. So we regressed daughter records. So we took the daughter records of those cows and then we regressed them on sire PTAs to evaluate if the cows were expressing what the sire PTAs had mentioned. So this was done in December of 2018. So the data that we're looking at is going to be outdated because we have sire evaluations 3 times a year. And so we looked at calvings for these cows from 2012 to 2017. And again, we're only looking at organic Jersey cows. So we had cows from 13 states and from 31 organic herds. And then this is a table of the number of daughters per sire. So we can see here that the top sire that had the most amount of daughters, 185 daughters from the organic Jersey data set. The top sire was T-Bone. And so I just pulled the top 10 sires listed by the number of daughters. And so for our important traits again, so when we're thinking about net merit, which is something that a lot of producers utilize to select their sires based on, again, this is in dollars. We can see that there's a wide range where some of the sires had -53 net merit, and some of the sires had upwards to higher of 278. And so I wanted to also mention something in the beginning that we said was that fertility component. So while fertility is important, what we realized was that the most frequently used sire had a lower daughter pregnancy rate. So for those of you that have looked at the daughter pregnancy rate, 1 unit increase in the PTA for daughter pregnancy rate means that there are fewer days open. So if it's negative, that means that that sire is expected for the offspring, the cow, to have more days open, and we want fewer days open, right? Because when we're talking about cost, the increase in days open can be costly. So when looking at our data for those organic Jersey cows, on average, those cows are producing 17,000 pounds and about 35, and there was a standard deviation of about 3,500 pounds. The fat content was 820 pounds on average, whereas the protein content was 624. And then I just want to mention these in reference to the national average for the Jersey cows. So the national average is 20,000 pounds for Jerseys for milk production, 980 pounds for fat, and 750 pounds for protein. So our numbers were quite a bit shy of that. And then another trait that's really important is for this days open. And again, we were really looking at the fertility component of these cows. And so we saw that the cows in the data set on average had 136 days open. But the national average for Jerseys for days open is 115. So upon our analysis, and again, we regressed those daughter records that we have on what their sire PTAs were for December of 2018. And so when we calculated that regression coefficient, this would explain how likely the daughter of that sire is expressing her genetic potential. So we saw that for milk, fat, protein, and somatic cell score, the expected coefficient is 1. And the calculated coefficients for milk, fat, and protein were relatively around 1, but for the somatic cell score, it was lower than 1. So we found that those Jersey daughters of those sires were expressing their potential for milk, fat, and protein, but we're not expressing that as well for the somatic cell score. And additionally, again, looking at that days open, so we expected that coefficient to be -4, again, because 1 unit increase in DPR means that the cow is expected to have 4 fewer days open. So we did see that the cow wasn't expressing her genetic potential for fertility. So we think that there's an opportunity for those dairy producers in organic herds that are utilizing Jersey bulls to select heavier on DPR, to select for bulls that are going to be positive for DPR. And so overall with this study, we did find that the US organic Jerseys, they were reflecting their genetic potential for milk, fat, and protein, but we did see an opportunity for heavier selection of Jersey bulls that were positive for DPR. Now I'm going to leave a second in case anyone has questions here related to this. Give a couple of seconds and I'll take a drink. Okay, I'll proceed and then just stop me if you need to unmute yourself or type in the chat because I'm monitoring that too. So the next thing I want to talk about is fly pressure. And I think it's apparent, everybody knows that fly pressure is a real pain in the rear on organic dairy herds and dairy herds in general. I personally absolutely hate flies because spending so many summers within our pastures and within flies, I would wear in the summer like my long sleeve and my long pants because I just can't stand those biting flies. So on average in the US, dairy producers will spend about $60 million in total on fly control. And in an organic dairy system, there's really no opportunity to use a synthetic pest control. So we have to rely on really good management, right? So the dairy industry and specifically dairy researchers within an organic production system are looking into genetic parameters of fly resistance. And so there has been some research done in beef herds for beef, not specifically organic, but just beef herds. And then there was some research done where they found that actually coat color was a way that you could reduce your fly count. So horn flies, and I'm going to show you each of these flies. Horn flies preferred red or black to white cattle. And so in this slide here, I have the most common, flies that you will see on an organic herd. So this is our house fly. And then this is our stable fly, which is the biting fly, and you'll see them down the legs of the cows. And so when cows are stomping and they're having that behavior, it's because they're getting bit by the stable flies. Then we of course have the face flies, and then the horn flies. And those are going to be flies that are biting and they're also collecting blood. So there's a lot of them, and you can see them across the backs of the cows. So 2 of our undergraduate students were interested in horn flies and in fly pressure. And so they said, let's look at some pigmentation of the cows. And if it's actually true that coat color is something that flies will avoid. So they took all of our purebred Holstein cows and then our crossbreds, and they divided them into the percentage of black or red that the cows were. So they took a picture of all the cows in an organic dairy herd, and then they categorized them. And then they actually saw that there was more fly pressure for dark and black cows. So this was just a short study that they did on their own. This wasn't published research. But the small sample size from our small sample size that we had for that summer indicated in this graph here that the total flies on the y-axis, and then the percentage of black that those cows were, or red. So we can see here that the cows were almost completely black. So we had more flies, and this was total flies, so horn flies, stable flies, and face flies collectively for those cows that were more black. So there was more fly pressure. And then additionally, when they only looked at horn flies, they saw that there tended to be more horn flies on cows that were black or dark. And then from there, this actually helped elicit a small little study that the Penn State researchers did. So this work was done by Bailey Basil, who is a student who's currently doing her PhD at the university at Penn State University. And she and collaborators such as Chad Dekow and Isaac Hagen and Lydia Hardy, they're doing a lot of this research related to looking at genetic parameters of organic cows. And so they did a short study where they took pictures of cows across some organic dairy herds in the US. And then they used a system that actually counted the number of flies that were on the cows. And so there was a range of 0 to 600 horn flies that were counted on a single part of the body across these herds. And the medium number of horn flies was about 16. So in this picture here, you can see how they categorized whether the cows had 0 to no flies. A score of 1 was anywhere from 11 flies to then a score of 4 was to a cow that had 295 flies. And so for that study, they visited herds from 2017 to 2019, and they visited 13 organic dairies across the US. And there was 640 cows that were Holstein that were given a fly score and then were evaluated for their coat color. And what they found in this study was that there was a decrease in fly loads and fly pressure associated with a white coat. So again, that was research that had been done way previous to this in the earlier 1990s regarding coat color. But because coat color is a polygenic trait and it's controlled by greater than one gene, there has to be more research done about selecting for cows with a white coat color. But they actually found that there was a positive and unfavorable relationship between fly pressure or fly load and the milk fat and protein, and I'm sorry, milk fat and milk production and fat. So this helped them understand that there was, when you select for a higher yield, so for a higher milk production and fat, there tended to be a negative relationship where those cows had more fly pressure. And then they are exploring a gene that the KIT gene that may be a gene that you can select for horn fly resistance. But until more research is conducted to determine, because again, we mentioned that the white coat color, that coat color is a polygenic trait. So until there's more research done, it's important that we understand that while yes, we can select for cows that are white because they will have reduced fly load, fly pressure. Those cows can be susceptible to diseases such as a sunburn or eye cancer. So we sort of have to evaluate the benefits of a lower fly pressure and fly loads and to those diseases. But there was a positive relationship for the heritability of fly score. So if we wanted to select for fly pressure, then we could make good genetic progress because this trait would be highly heritable. So we're going to have to continue to do a really good job with manure management, including fly traps and natural repellents, which I know that they don't last as long. The efficacy is about 2 hours and then that cow doesn't have the repellent anymore. But we're going to have to continue to do some of these management practices until we have more research and data. So I'm going to move on to another topic. And so I want to give time for everybody to have for me to answer any questions. And again, this research was done by the team at Penn State. But I wanted to make you aware that there is some research being done related to fly pressure. Alrighty. Let's see. John says, might the flies develop animal coat color resistance or change in preference over time? Good question. I don't have enough of an entomology background to know that the flies might become resistant, but I would certainly think yes, based on how other systems interact. So I think with anything there might be a natural resistance over time. So I would guess so, yes, to answer your question. Alrighty, so I'm going to talk a little bit about polled genetics. And when Heather and I first talked, this was something that she had mentioned that folks are really interested in, because I know that there might be consideration for dairy producers to only be able to use polled genetics. So there is a growing interest in polleds. And some might ask, well, why haven't we actually taken care of this? Why haven't we included more polled genetics? And the dairy industry focused on other traits that were, you know, the main focus at that time. So for example, being the dairy industry, we focus on production. And then when we maybe have shifted to what our products are going into, such as cheese, we've changed to those components. So I think the dairy industry really tackles what's most important at the time. And potentially polled genetics hasn't come up as that reason. So all breeds do have a natural ability to be hornless. And some breeds actually have more horned animals than others, such as the Norwegian red dairy breed. But I want to mention that for the Holstein breed specifically, a lot of the Holstein polled bulls, not all, but a lot of them actually have so they're inferior in net merit to other animals. So that's something to consider about polled genetics, is that we have made a lot of genetic progress, especially for the other traits. But when thinking about genetic progress, it's just that the polled bulls tend to be inferior relative to the population. But you can use Norwegian red bulls because about 60% of the calves in Norway are actually born hornless. And the beef industry has actually seen a great reduction in horned bulls. From 1992 to 2007 in the US, they've actually seen a 60% reduction in calves that were born hornless. And so just to talk to you a little bit about how polled genetics happens. So when we're selecting for polled bulls, polled is a single dominant trait, meaning that if you have a true polled bull, it's a PP bull, it's polled, it's a dominant. And you mate that sire, so that bull with a horned animal, because horned is a single recessive trait. You will get a polled animal because again, a polled is a single dominant trait, so you will see that that animal become polled. When you have an animal that is only polled for one of its genes, you're going to have the chance of an animal being 50% polled and 50% horned. And so forth. And so I just want to highlight in this slide that becoming polled it does require some time because again, we're going to have to consider, we're not only going to, select that bull for that one trait, but we're going to have to consider all of the other traits because we want to be mindful of that genetic progress. And I do believe that we will see an increase in the number of polled bulls that we have available to dairy producers. So I think that as we see a trend for needing polled genetics, that the efforts will come naturally where we will see that the polled bulls will increase in their genetic potential. And then so we'll have more bulls to select from. But I think, again, this is going to happen, and it's not going to happen overnight. And when we're selecting, it's important to select for that PP, so that it's that dominant polled gene and it's a true polled bull, because that can really help you have polled or hornless animal. And then again, as I mentioned, this is sort of like a balancing game where you don't want to lose out on an animal that's not going to make you any production or that's not going to have functionality, but is hornless. There's a lot of things to consider when you're selecting for a polled bull. And then I pulled this report for the Jersey and Holstein bulls that are polled. So homozygous polled, those PP bulls, and then those polled bulls where they're just heterozygous for polled. But again, that's that dominant trait. So we see here in the first top of the slide that we have our Jersey polled bulls, and these are homozygous PP bulls. And so again, this is from August 2021. And I want to mention that if we can see here, so for our top bull, and this is measured on the Jersey Performance Index. This is organized by the Jersey Performance Index. We can see that this top bull has actually a positive DPR, but then some of the other bulls might have a negative DPR. So it's important again to consider our important traits such as fertility, as well as net merit, fat, and protein. And then for our polled Holstein bulls, similarly, so this is here organized by TPI, the Total Performance Index. But again, for our polled bulls, it's just important to consider our net merit, as well as our productive life and our DPR. So again, there's a fair bit of those bulls that have a negative DPR. And so when we're trying to select for a polled bull, it's important to just consider the other traits that you might not make genetic gain in and that you want to. And so at the end of this presentation, I want to reemphasize that when making any of these breeding and genetic considerations, it's important to think about your market. So if you are selling to somewhere where they require you to think about fly pressure, or they require you to think about other breeds because of that inbreeding depression, that over time, I only think that the inbreeding coefficient will increase in the Holstein and the Jersey breed. And then again, when we're thinking about the optimal cow for a pasture-based system, in my experience, I don't know that the cows that are larger in stature, that tend to be more tall, are the best for an organic in a pasture-based system. They're required, like I said, it requires them to harvest their own feed. And so, considering how much they have to walk and the environment they're in, there may be other breeds that may fit better in an organic and pasture-based system. And then I hope that everybody, if you take one thing away from my presentation, it's that you make progress in your right direction. So think about your goals and think about what it is that where you want to be in 5 to 10 years. So use a genetic index, because that's a really good way to make progress and sort of keep up with the genetic progress within our industries, because that net merit index or the grazing merit index are going to include those traits that you are going to want to make genetic progress on, specifically the traits that are going to be costly, right? So we added feed saved, for example, this year, and residual feed intake. So those are traits to keep an eye out for when we're trying to select sires that we use on our dairy farms. And then again, using artificial insemination will help you make progress towards your right direction. And if we think about, the sires that are currently active today and that you can buy compared to the sires that if you have a natural service bull, that that bull is going to be already a year or 2 years old, and we've selected for some other bulls in that meantime. So I think artificial insemination is something to definitely consider. And when you're thinking about making progress in whatever your right direction is. And so with that, I just wanted to give a second to thank my collaborators, because this research was obviously research that I did during my PhD and my master's degree. So Brad Hines from the University of Minnesota, Kirsten Sharp from the University of Minnesota, and Les Hansen. And then the folks at Penn State, Chad Deckow and Lydia Hardy, Isaac and Bailey as well. And so with that, I look forward to any discussion we can have for our remainder of the time. And then keep in mind, if you want to follow up with me, email me, give me a call. My information is on this slide. I'd be happy to chat. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Glenda. That was wonderful. And thanks for covering so much ground. It was really interesting. And how did you, I might have missed this part, but the photo of the flies on the cows that were glowing, was that something you enhanced in the photo, or did you make the flies drink fluorescent something or other?
Oh, so this is,
it's just a map.
The team at Penn State they have a software that actually counts the number of flies, so that we're taking the subjective part out of it, right? Counting
Right.
flies is something that takes a while to be comfortable doing, but I might count 40 flies, you might count 60. So there's a lot of subjectivity to fly counting and other things. So that this is just the software marking the flies on the cows.
That is so cool. Anyway,
Yeah.
thanks for sharing that. There's one question, and please, folks, get your questions in the chat. There were lots of requests around hearing about breeds and breeding and strategies. So I know that folks, have questions. John's asking, might the flies develop animal coat color resistance or change in preference over time? That's a good question.
We already addressed that. So
Sorry.
no, you're good. So I think knowing how other systems work and knowing how, for example, like antibiotics work, I think there would be a resistance, and I think ticks have a resistance factor as well. So I would expect this would be a question for an entomologist, but I would expect yes. Yeah.
See, Leon added in, well, if they've only have one color to choose from.
Right. Yeah. Yep. No, good point. And so I think this is an opportunity for again, selecting for that, and over time, potentially you're going to have animals that will have a less of a fly load, but we're never going to get rid of really managing properly, our manure, our bedding, and any of those things on our farms. So I think the two things go hand in hand.
Great. Well, I'm kind of circling back to any priorities, I guess, that you have, Glenda, now that you're back here in the Northeast, around, what kind of research you're thinking you might want to start focusing on, or priorities, any kind of glimpses into what you want to work on here in the very near future?
Obviously, I think we need to sort of hang on to our strengths, because that's what we're going to do really well in, right? So I think I'll continue some research regarding crossbreeding, because I don't know that a lot of folks potentially have been exposed to how to implement crossbreeding. And I didn't really talk about that. I really wanted to cover a wide variety of topics so that folks were aware and then can do some follow-up research or reach out to me if they'd like. So doing some crossbreeding research, and again, that Grace crossbreeding rotation is really in the preliminary stages. So that's something that I'd like to continue to do. Specifically for Maine, our organic producers here are faced with the challenge of PFAS, and specifically because if you might be aware of the PFAS issue, those polyfluoroalkyl substances that are forever chemicals. And for organic producers specifically, so those chemicals are really persistent in grass, but not in the fruit of the plant. And so when we think about the fact that organic producers have to continuously graze, they don't have an option, right? They can't just buy in feed that is not contaminated with PFAS. So I'm going to be doing some research regarding that and how we can track PFAS in dairy animals. And then I think there's a real opportunity for utilizing more precision technologies, and especially in organic herds. So for example, for estrus detection, other than visual observation or an estrotech patch, we don't have a way to detect estrus. So utilizing a system such as the ear tags or the collars, and then in concert, maybe potentially adapting a robotic system, whether that looks like, I've seen some really nice like fence moving systems that are robotic, or in Chagas in Ireland, they actually have their robots centrally located, and then they have a bunch of paddocks, and those cows rotationally graze every 6 hours so that you're motivating them to come back through the robot. So those are some of the things that I'm currently looking forward to, but within the next year, I will have a better idea of the needs of Maine dairy producers and New England producers. And so at that point, I think I'll really have a better idea of exactly what research projects I'm going to be doing.
Great. Yeah, that there's never a shortage of things to do, as you know. I'm really interested as well, sort of in this area of technology on farms to really help improve management on all different levels, and we're pretty excited about that. I'm curious about Maine's focus on greenhouse gas emissions, and if there's any work that you're being asked to do with dairy farms there in Maine, as I don't think I mentioned today. Oh, I did mention that we had some talks about this earlier in the week, because the ag industry here in Vermont is being required to reduce emissions by 40%. So we're really thinking about that a lot. Any suggestions or thoughts on that?
A good question. I think something I still struggle to understand is how we evaluate that. Like, how do we evaluate how much we're reducing and how much we're working towards? Because I think we're doing a fantastic job already. One, because as I mentioned, we've made a lot of genetic progress, and what our cows are producing 60 years ago is not what the cows that are producing today. So we've made a lot of genetic progress, and I think that's where genetics plays in really nice into the methane reduction component, because if there is a trait we can select for and it has relatively good heritability, so we're able to make progress, right? Because when you have a lowly heritable trait, you're not able to make as much progress year after year. So I think genetics, there's an opportunity, as well as other feedstuffs. So I haven't been part of the game so I haven't worked with Andre at all, but I know that there's been a seaweed and kelp project that he's participating in Bigelow with the Bigelow organization with. And here in Maine, obviously, we have access to a lot of different feedstuffs that the rest of the country doesn't. So is that something that we can utilize? But really just being really efficient in all of our practices. So I know, like, including legumes in your pasture, and, you know, maybe rotating with some warm season grasses and in the summer, so that you're utilizing your feed as efficiently as you can, right? You know, if the cows haven't trimmed the pasture completely, then like mowing after, I think, would be really useful. There's some of those management aspects that I think we can continue to improve. But on the genetic side of it, I think, you know, including feed saved as a trait will help us select for cows that eat less feed during their lactation. So I think that over time we'll sort of have you know, cows that are really feed efficient. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
Great.
But in Maine, unfortunately, like I mentioned, there's this other pressing matter, PFAS related. So that's where I think a lot of our efforts stand right now.
We've definitely heard a lot about that in Vermont and around the region. And we're getting a lot of questions and concern from various folks about what's happening here in Vermont. I have sort of heard a bit that the cases in Maine are sort of based on some biosolid applications that were from the past and now causing some real issues. So it's pretty specific, it seems, anyway. Would you say that's relatively true?
And so, you know, some of the challenges that folks that maybe have come into this farm, they don't if there isn't good records, then that begs the question of, well, should I test or should I not test? What will I find? And then again, like I said, you know, one of the herds that was that is now back online is organic, but they were able to clear some land to, you know, have a pasture because we can't get around that. And so that creates a real challenge and bottleneck for those organic producers.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there'll be more to come, and I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So
Okay.
I'm assuming that folks are, yeah, good for today, at least in this moment. And for those that need CCA credits, I put that up on the screen today. And Glenda, thank you so much. Really looking forward to working with you, and everyone else is cheering you on and saying thank you as well. So with that, everyone, we have one more webinar in our series next week with Sarah Flack and Jen Miller, talking about the cost of production in organic and grass-fed dairy systems. There's also a couple of e-organic dairy webinars coming up as well, focusing on our grass-fed research. So you can find those on our website too. So with that, everyone, thank you, Glenda, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye.